So this is a public-private game in the end. It is a collaboration, and that is why we have invited these panelists. The market has to be on board as we take on these challenges and make the most of these opportunities. So with that introduction, I would now like to start with the first question for our friend Carla Vergara, who is with PROPANAMA. She's the general administrator and she's a former secretary general of SIECA. So, Ambassador Vergara, from Panama's perspective, and I ask you as former Secretary General of SIECA, how would it be possible to achieve inclusive and sustainable regional integration in a way that contributes to these objectives of growth and development? Thank you, Fabricio. Good afternoon to everyone. Let me start by thanking you for your invitation. I have always said that we cannot solve regional problems with national public policy. So the first thing we need is those points of agreement that affect all the countries in the region. Education, for example, supply chains in the region and how we can make the most of them, especially now with the nearshoring trends, which offer us an opportunity to trade not only consumer goods, but also inputs for production. And we need to seek out public policies which have a regional scope, which are predicated on solving problems which affect all countries in the region. I think that would be a step in the right direction. This region has many complementarities, but our countries are different. So we need to make the most of our complementarity, avoid competing, and promote cooperation so that we can then compete globally in markets that are demanding not only sustainable but also high quality products. So that is a key opportunity. Unfortunately, and we see this in many countries, economic development does not necessarily bring social development. That economic growth can happen without social development. And if we're not careful in harnessing public policy and strategies to achieve that end result, social development, then unfortunately, even if, well, economic development does not equal social development, but social development cannot happen without economic development. So we need to promote economic development in the region in a way that is sustainable. Our region is very rich in diversity, as previous panels have said, and we must take care of that diversity for the future. At some point, the concept that you can do well by doing good was forgotten, and some companies, to get ahead, have taken up practices that are not sustainable. And now we know that that is not true, that being sustainable is a good business. More than 43% of consumers around the world are demanding sustainable products from companies that use sustainable processes. And that is why ProPanama tries to approach or tries to find those companies that have certified processes and products. And we also want to support local companies so that they can become type B companies. And that would enable us to have a positive impact on the development we need through foreign direct investment with a transfer of technology, but an investment that makes it possible to diversify our exports by adding domestic value added to our export products, not to bring products from outside to assemble them here. Rather, we want to produce the inputs that are needed and be able to work through the entire chain so that our people can enjoy better labor opportunities. So I think that we need to see ourselves as a region, not as countries that are competing with each other, and find a way to achieve consensus, to establish public policies that will help us all move in the same direction, leaving no one behind. So sustainability as a value and as a factor of profitability. From the perspective of a company like Telefonica, how would you say companies can contribute to the regional integration process in the region? Thank you, Fabricio. Thank you for the invitation. There's three things I would like to talk about. Companies can do many things, but there's three I think come first. The first is obvious, we need to do our job. Telecom operators have to build the digital connectivity infrastructure the region needs. In your introduction, you said that most investments in infrastructure came from the public sector in the region. And that may be true when it comes to roads or sanitation, but that is not the case when it comes to telecommunication. In Latin America, that infrastructure has been built mainly by the private sector. One thing we should ask ourselves is what happens with international internet traffic? How do we connect with the rest of the world? And the fact is that we do so using infrastructure like SAM1, which is an underground cable Telefonica built almost 20 years ago as it was getting ready for the region's growth. So this is underwater and all over Latin America, telecom companies have built the infrastructure which does make it possible for our region to be connected to the world via internet. So we need to do our job first. Secondly, I believe there is a great opportunity, and we saw that with Telefonica Latin America. We can transform the world in which we do business. Until 2019, we had a series of local operations. In November 2019, we built a business unit called Telefónica Hispanoamérica to manage a territory which spans 8 countries of the region in a multi-country approach. And this is something that was, in a way, boosted by the pandemic because it forced us to manage our company virtually. And some of that is still with us, and that made it possible for us to scale up projects and share experiences more quickly. So in 2020, we launched the first neutral fiber operator in Chile. And shortly after that, not even 6 months later, we launched the same concept in Colombia. So that shows you how we were able to accelerate this because the team which had done the project in Chile then developed it in Colombia. And as we speak, we are looking into other similar projects for the region. In 3 years, we've been able to build a entire series of projects with a regional scope. And I think this ties in with what Karla was saying. I think as companies, we must participate in the public private dialogue, which is taking place at the regional level. Our region, if you will, is exuberant. It has an abundance of coordination instruments, and I can give you 15 acronyms and we can play the game trying to go over these acronyms. But I think what we need to do is identify fora where we can have or play this relevant role. Let me give you just one example. The principles for rural connectivity approved less than a year ago. I think they can shed light indicating which policies the region needs to expand connectivity without leaving anyone behind. The digital dimension, digital highways, video games, software, Hollywood movies that win awards, all of that can be achieved through technology. So it's a dimension of integration that is not limited to services, and it is very important. Karla, welcome. SIEPAC was an emblematic project, and I'd like to ask you what has been the major impact of SIEPAC when it comes to regional integration to date, and what do you see happening in the future? Good afternoon. I thank our audience for being with us this afternoon. Before I speak about the topic raised by Fabricio, SIEPAC is the interconnection project for Central American countries. So it is the backbone of the infrastructure, or it's the backbone of the infrastructure and power sector in this region. It's hard to describe impact limiting myself to one area, but I would say that SIEPAC is an example of how you can do what Fabricio was saying. SIEPAC has contributed to the regional power sector by improving generation, improving the reliability and the coverage of services. We are countries that share the power sector. We complement each other, and it applies to the resources in the power sector as well. And this has had a positive impact. The vision began many years ago. The IDB was a partner from the beginning, and the benefits we have seen have included price reductions, which we would say have been to the tune of 60%. This is since we began and up to 2021. Energy also, the last 5 years, there was an increase of 60%. And this means that our power systems can be more effective when it comes to generation. In addition to that, there's been another positive impact, which has a lot to do with what Fabricio was mentioning, and it is institutions. Our market has sound institutions. We are the infrastructure company, but there's also a market operator, the regulator, and the policymaking body, and it works. We have standards that apply equally to all. And as Carmen said, it's not a national policy, it is a regional policy. It began as a vision which has led to the integration and the benefits we enjoy today. Are they enough? No. Do we still have a long road ahead? Yes. But the initiative to date has been successful. So, what comes next? Our countries are seeing their challenges grow when it comes to energy and increasing consumption. In order to achieve sustainable growth, we're going to continue to need more infrastructure. We're going to need the support of organizations. So I trust that the IDB's invitation sends the signal that it will continue to support the region in its development so that we can keep pace with global policies in this regard. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much. And my answer is yes, definitely yes. Our president was categorical this morning. Ilan Goldfein, when he spoke, he did clearly say that he was ready to support integration, and we understand it has many different areas. My colleague Ariel Yepes is one of the people working with this. But again, I take note of what you said. Institutions and the quality of institutions and continuity are extremely important.
Bosco Marti, what's the experience of Aliatica been like in terms of cooperation with governments and other businesses, especially to strengthen the transport infrastructure in a region and in order to be able to advance towards more effective integration through transport? Thank you very much, Fabricio. It's a pleasure to be with such eminent personalities, and thanks to the audience. I also see the director of the Central Bank of Guatemala, the director of the Atlantic Council, several former colleagues from the board. Thank you very much. Well, Aliatica is an Australian company, part of an investment fund IFM investors with $220 billion. It invests in various projects. It takes a long-term view. The fund owners are 19 pension funds. So the long-term view allows us to have a different perspective to that of other infrastructure operators. Allow me to provide two specific examples regarding the importance of these partnerships between businesses, government, and the private sector for infrastructure generation. Recently, in the Mexican case, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador embraced the new Felipe Ángeles Airport project as a flagship project. It was built in record time, and we were asked to work on the infrastructure to connect to the airport. Normally, the project would have taken 24 months, and it was carried out in only 8 months. And if it hadn't been for the support of the federal and state governments, as well as other businesses that helped us all along, it would have been virtually impossible. Another recent example we had was in Italy with a very nice project, L'Arena del Futuro, which invited several universities from the region, the federal and regional Italian governments, as well as some private sector partners, especially Stellantis and Iveco, and we developed a 1 kilometer long circuit to break several paradigms with regard to longer distance electromobility. The cars are recharged as they circulate around that circuit. This is still in a test phase, but for closed systems like, trucks or VTR systems or airports, that is a perfectly feasible solution. The only way to achieve this is by having a rule of law, institutional structures, and by doing this joint work between the private and public sectors and academia, and of course, development banks have a key role to play as part of that. Thank you very much, Bosco. And that is certainly a core element, the rule of law, as you rightly pointed out. Elena, a warm welcome. You've come all the way from Spain, and we are truly honored. What is the Interreg Spain-Portugal cross-border cooperation program, POCTEP in the acronym? Tell us a bit about that and what lessons it can offer the region. Thank you very much, Fabricio. I would also like to thank the IDB for the invitation to be here with you today, both those physically present as well as those following on social media and the internet. What is POCTEP and how it works, you ask? Well, this is an acronym, a POCTEP, which is the operational program for cross-border cooperation between Spain and Portugal, which is one of the programs as part of the Interreg Community Initiative, the main EU instrument to finance cooperation in order to strengthen social, economic, and territorial cohesion, as well as to lessen the disparities between regions and member states. This is one of the programs that Interreg has, and it is the 6th generation of these Interreg programs. So that you get the picture, it's the largest program in the EU with 1,234 kilometers, the longest border in the continent, and there are 6 cooperation zones addressing the different needs across the territory to better address the challenges in each jurisdiction, and it has significant funds allocations for the current 2021 to 27 period. It has 427 million euros. and between 14 and 20, 424. So how does this work? Let me briefly explain. There is a program document that is agreed on by the member states and approved by the European Commission, as part of which, on the basis of certain pillars, the rules of operation are established. These pillars are policy objectives, certain areas to work on, in addition to the financial allocation for the fund to work, in addition to management structures to allow the program to function. And the thematic areas reflect the EU goal of achieving a smarter, greener, more social, and closer to citizens Europe. And the areas of the POCTEP focus are competitiveness as well as research and development, the environment, climate change, and biodiversity, the challenge in terms of the demographic challenge with all of the implications in terms of health, finance, tourism, heritage, as well as institutional strategies to address the needs of citizens on the different levels. That would be, in a nutshell, the scope of POCTEP. I feel like double-clicking for each of those, but we'll leave that for later on in the panel. Institutions, financial resources, and consensus, all very important components to achieve the goals of the pillars. Eleonora, a warm welcome to you too. Digitization and accelerated digitization processes, which have sped up even more during the pandemic, have posed challenges to satisfy connectivity and access needs in terms of digital services. Again, the role of digital infrastructure as part of the process. What is that, and what are the opportunities for our region to better harness digitalization? Well, thank you very much, Fabricio, for the invitation. Thanks to the IDB, and thanks to those of you who have stayed on and are also watching online. Let me first tell you what Google's view is with regard to the development of the digital economy in the region. We have a presence in Latin America since 2005, and we see vast potential for the development of the digital economy. As discussed in the previous panel, some figures were quoted with regard to the number of unicorns and also with regard to the talent and innovation in the region. Just a figure, last year, e-commerce in Latin America, which was the area where e-commerce grew most globally, one of the indicators of the existing potential. Let me tell you, the investments in infrastructure and in capital are key in order to leverage the growth of the digital economy. And last year at the Americas Summit, our CEO, von der Pichai, announced Google's commitment to invest $1.2 billion over 5 years to leverage and further leverage the growth of the digital economy with a focus on various pillars, one of them being precisely physical infrastructure. How do we invest in infrastructure in the region, in Latin America? Well, we first have a deployment of submarine cables. Actually, Jose Juan talked about the cables that support connectivity in the region. We support connectivity through 5 cables in Latin America that connect different parts of our region with other regions. For example, Firmina, the last one we announced and which we are deploying, that will connect Argentina to the United States with extensions onto Uruguay and Brazil. Otanat, which, as the name suggests, is a cable we developed in cooperation with Antel, the Uruguayan telecoms company, a very successful example of private-public partnership. Again, this is an area with great opportunities for such cooperation. Ocuri for Chile and the United States, with an extension in Panama, and Monet and Junior in Brazil. These are some of the cables that we have globally and in Latin America. And these cables don't just foster and support the connectivity of our users and clients, but they also improve connectivity for all system users, in addition to having an economic impact. In order to measure the economic impact from the submarine cables with all of the resulting implications, we asked Mason to come up with an economic impact report, which we will soon be sharing. But I think one telling figure is the one that shows that additional accumulated GDP created through these cables is $178 million. It's very interesting to measure the impact of cables in terms of the economic activities that are made possible. We also invest in data centers. We have one in Quimicura in Chile, which is operated 100% through renewable energies. And we have two cloud regions in Santiago and Sao Paulo, and one we have announced and are developing in Mexico. So we invest in the different layers and levels of infrastructure. And as you said at the outset, there's a digital infrastructure gap in the region even today. And we at Google want to be partners in infrastructure development and be active in developing the infrastructure in partnership with the public sector and with multilaterals like the IDB, making this sustainable. This ties in with the discussions on the previous panel. This is why our data center and our cloud regions are run 100% on renewables. This is why our cloud is among the cleanest and most efficient in the industry. We are committed to being a carbon-free business by 2030. This is part of what we're doing and part of the path we are embarked on across the region and globally. Thank you. As you mentioned, Tanat, and as a Uruguayan, it makes me homesick. But digital and physical infrastructure is key to boost the region as an e-commerce hub with better ports, airports, border crossings, facilitating trade and customs. That is the major agenda. Giuseppina, welcome, benvenuta. How can a telecoms operator contribute to the integration process, to the matters we are discussing in this region, and what are the future prospects for the industry in strengthening connectivity in the region? Well, first of all, thank you very much. The advantage of being the last one to speak, and having had the honor and pleasure to listen to such an illustrious and distinguished panel. I would also like to thank our audience. Fabrizio, in responding to your question, I share Medicom's view and, having been over 3 decades in the region with operations in Colombia, Paraguay, and Bolivia, our purpose, well, this is a well-known fact, and thanks for mentioning this, is to really build digital highways. That was always our goal, the purpose being related to our vision, which is to bring not just connectivity, but also to afford access to the advantages that connectivity can offer, bringing communities closer to each other. And of course, there are many and dynamic. And the vision of the operator, creating this container which is homogeneous, but which has become, let us say, tropicalized. This is a word I have learned now. I would say it's not a dilemma, but that's a crux of the matter post-pandemic, which, by the way, in many respects, for example, when it comes to the relations between public administration and citizens, digitalization has grown a lot and offers a lot of information opportunities to citizens. Of course, there's reference to the many gaps. There was recently the Mobile World Congress, and there's a gap in use because the investment has taken place. The latest GSMA report talks about 96% mobile broadband coverage, but still 31% of the population don't connect, even if they have access. So clearly, there's a differentiated discourse and process, which has to do with prices, with devices and prices, and it also has to do with the revamping of existing infrastructure, and it also has to do with acquiring the skills in order to be able to understand what the opportunities are. So operators now, I would say, have the right, I'll say it, to invest in a diversified, dynamic manner in such a way that their investments are valued and protected. As Jose Juan said, in our sector, most of the investments are private. And certainly, having that regulatory framework is important because at the end of the day, it's about sharing experiences within a regionalized framework with the possibility of replication and replication in different contexts. And the vision has to be a long-term one. If each one of us does our work, we still have to have a shared approach. The value chain we are trying to digitize needs to play its part in ensuring that its services are digitized and affordable and accessible. So one important takeaway is considering the different gaps and dealing with them along with the actors of the value chain that are responsible for those areas. And this existing infrastructure, for example, you have areas that are densely populated and others that are rural areas, a fact of life in this region. And of course, there will be a growth in capacity, so that needs to be taken into account. So there has to be regulatory, social, and economic issues that need to be addressed. But we shouldn't forget about the basic connectivity that will be the basis for economic growth and diversification going forward. So a long-term view, regulatory convergence, and you've added a new element to the discussion, which is the gap in use and access, which is a social issue too, because integration obviously also relates to empowering citizens in order for them to be able to connect to the world through such tools. So that's highly interesting. Carmen, back to you for this second round of questions to wrap up a day that has been very full and interesting and rich. What are the strategies and policies that are being implemented in Panama to promote the export of both goods and services that are sustainable with value added? Many of the topics that were touched upon here. Any initiatives that could perhaps illustrate this for us? Thank you very much, Fabricio. Well, here we have two strategies in Panama, one aimed at attracting investments and also integrated trade promotion and export opening opportunities, which is our strategic exports approach. On the investments front, we had a strategy and a 5-year program developed in 2019. But as reflected by all of the discussions we're having, there was the pandemic. So the world changed, and it changed suddenly and profoundly and forever. So we had to reconsider what we already had based on the new normal, as it came to be called during the pandemic. You know, all of these things that had to prepare us for what would then follow. And certainly during the pandemic, one of the key elements was connectivity, which allowed us to continue working from home and allowed us to stay connected to the world, watching the news, hearing about what was going on. And that meant that nearly everything was just a click away. So at the time of rethinking and taking a new look at the things we were doing, we examined what sectors were growing most during the pandemic and what sectors were poised to grow more after the pandemic. And we looked at what Panama had to offer, and this led to the strategy with a value proposition based on Panama becoming a sustainable investment hub for Latin America and the Caribbean, the hub. As you will know, Panama is one of the 3 carbon neutral countries in the world. And just a couple of weeks ago here, we had the Oceans Forum, which also gave us an opportunity to present an initiative which makes Panama one of the major countries with the largest protected marine areas in the world. So this is an issue that is very important and relevant to us. And so we have three hubs. We have the hubs and the sectors as part of the strategy. A logistical hub with the nearshoring trend, the digital hub with the digital nomads trend, the food hub with the superfoods trend and the production of food products that will boost your immune system. There's also the energy hub, of course, related to the fact that sustainability needs mechanisms that will allow industrial development, but also household development in a sustainable way, in addition to the very proactive, aggressive energy transition strategy to achieve clean energy. Carbon neutrality is also a driver for us to look at new alternatives like green hydrogen and electromobility, both in the public and private sectors, in addition to the tourism sector, which is the smoke-free strategy that includes also convention or conference tourism. In fact, this convention center is the largest one in the region, and all of this also brings us to the strategy to attract investments and also to foster exports. We attract investments to help us diversify our exports of goods or services by adding value to our export products while transferring knowledge and technology by using disruptive technologies in order to become more competitive in terms of our export offer and to make our production and export sector more competitive as well. So we are also working on this new agri-park trend, seeking to foster smart agriculture, precision agriculture and cattle breeding, controlled environments, genetic biotechnology applied to food production, and even blockchain for traceability purposes. So we actually have a whole set of internal domestic strategies which help us boost the opportunities that the country has in order for businesses to settle down in Panama, produce here, and export to the region. So these are certainly ambitious strategies as part of this hub for the Americas. I will pick up on what you talked about, investment hubs. How to attract more private investment in the sector of physical and digital infrastructure, Juan. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What are the barriers? Tell us a bit about that. Well, before talking about the barriers, let me share some data with you and also share the sort of view we have for the region. Ever since we launched the business in Chile and later in Colombia, at Telefónica, we have built the main fiber optics structure for households. We are close to 15 million households in the region, and much of the deployment took place even during the pandemic. And I mention this because Ricardo Bonilla, in the previous session on the previous panel from Findeter, said that he thought it was a necessity to connect the region through fiber optics. We agree with this. We talked about submarine cables at the outset, and certainly some of them are an important investment. But in the telecom sector, over 80% of investments take place in access, in household client service, in deploying mobile networks. So how can we carry out profitable deployment projects in Latin America? One example is fiber. The other one is Internet for All in Peru, a rural business we created along with the IDB, CAF, and Meta 3 years ago, which has connected 3 million Peruvians on the basis of the same paradigm. What is that paradigm? What is the vision we want to convey? It is about partnerships, cooperation, and collaboration. We think that in order for our region to be able to dare to dream, of connecting all of its citizens. For that, we need to reduce the unnecessary duplication of facilities and of infrastructure while facilitating the use and accordingly the profit of the things that are built. And we're doing that through UNED in Chile, where infrastructure attends to Telefónica, but we have also signed a contract with Entel to enhance the infrastructure. In the case of Internet for All in rural areas, the infrastructure currently serves 3 of the 4 mobile telephony operators in the country, Telefónica, Entel, and Carla. So collaborating and cooperating are necessary in order to get to the last mile. What are the barriers we face when it comes to making the cooperation viable? I would mention 3 points that I think are important. First, we need to revise the fiscal policy. We've said that most infrastructure sectors like roads or sanitation are public investment intensive. From the point of view of the public budget, there's more public funds placed in this sector than taken out through taxes. And yet it is the telecom sector that on this panel, on the previous one, has been defined as the future highway. Well, there, the fiscal view is exactly the opposite. The expectation of governments is to get more funds out through taxes than the amount of public funds allocated to building the infrastructure. And significant gaps continue to exist. So the question we need to ask ourselves is whether in this sector it is sensible to keep special taxes and contributions which place the sector in a position that is even more than income tax. And something specific to our sector has to do with the need to review the spectrum policy, which led to very high revenue in the past, but which no longer makes sense nowadays. The spectrum policy needs to have a focus on expanding service rather than on relying on a revenue collection principle. And finally, you said this at the outset, Fabricio, legal certainty. Legal certainty and transparency in processes is essential in a sector that invests for the long term. And we note with concern an increase, not just in our sector, but also in other infrastructure sector. We see the increase in international disputes. At ICSID and across the region, we see changes in the rules of play. For example, the not so recent regulation of mobile services in Argentina and other countries in the region. I'll leave it at that. So collaboration, cooperation, consensus, I would add that C, and on the IDB side will always be behind the drive to come up with dialogue and cooperation platforms. Karla, from the perspective of the network owner company, what has been the greatest impact of in terms of regional integration through SIEPAC so far? What are your thoughts on that? And I would add one more thing. I would relate that to PPPs and how PPPs may prove to be a mechanism to facilitate energy transition process in the energy sector, precisely.
These APR is a clear example of a PPP. Back in the 90s, when the term was not as widely known as it is now, but that gives us an advantage because we are a public-private partnership. So we're a private company, and that has made it possible for us to operate more easily in the market without bypassing the laws on transparency and efficiency. Because what we want is development for the Central American region. The treaty establishing us as an entity required that we perform a number of functions, including our role in transmission, which is established in the law. But one of the rules, or one of the advantages rather, is that we're neutral vis-a-vis the market when it comes to electricity, we're also neutral when it comes to country interest. So our aim is developing the entire Central American region. So we are trying to help with all the challenges we face as a region in transmission and efficiency. So we're not just performing the functions established in the SIEPAC circuit agreement, but we're also working with countries which have asked for our help in developing their national electricity networks. We are looking at concrete projects in Honduras and Nicaragua, and these are not part of the SIEPAC line per se, but they are necessary in order to boost the development of this market, which is our ultimate objective. We are also undertaking a number of studies to identify mechanisms at the regional level, which would make it possible to have more flexible networks so that we can store energy, so that we can be more participatory and more active in supporting our countries with their energy transitions. We face many challenges because in order to embark on an energy transition, we can only work in the electricity power sector, which is our sphere of action. You have to do more. There has to be more integrated regional planning. So this is not limited to electricity, it also involves the transportation sector. We feel, or at least I feel personally, that back in the 90s, when SIEPAC was launched, a series of circumstances converged, and the most important one may have been the political will to make this project happen. And I think the region's experience with SIEPAC is quite positive and should be extrapolated to other sectors, infrastructure and economic development, for example. When I spoke earlier, I spoke about standards and about institutions. These are the factors that guarantee that we are all treated equally, that we all have equal access and we can all participate in development. So, another thing I'd like to stress is the role played by the IDB. It was instrumental in making things happen at the time. The conditions may have been very different. The electricity markets were held by integrated companies, and that made things easier. But in other sectors, the situation is not all that different. So public private partnerships could, again, be the vehicle to achieve these objectives in sectors that are key for the region's development. I'll stop here in view of the hour. While we hope to continue collaborating, we would very much like to see many more CFACs. I know that, Fabricio. So, speaking of PPPs and transportation, and this is a good segue to Bosco, we'd like to hear your views, Bosco, on how PPPs can help provide integration momentum in the sustainable transportation sector? That's a great question. We're increasingly seeing how budgets, especially in Latin America, are more focused on social spending in order to reduce inequalities in the region. So, what we see is that the budgets earmarked for infrastructure have been shrinking. So, this is where the private sector plays a key role. We say that these are long term investments, these are investments where we see institutional investors who are interested in these projects. And we believe that there is an opportunity now to look into concessions and how we could have a new generation of concession titles. Many of the ones we have date back to the last century and have not changed much. So we need to be more mindful of an ESG strategy. We need to have more flexibility to accommodate different needs. And We need to have concession titles that we would like to call new generation vehicles. There's two examples I'd like to share, things we've just done in the region. One, the Amerigo Vespucio Oriente Highway in Chile. It's an urban highway, spans slightly more than 9 kilometers. It's an underground highway which aims to help reduce transportation time. The investment was close to $1 billion, and had it not been done under a concession arrangement, it would have been very difficult for it to happen or to become a reality. Also in Peru, we have Autopista del Norte, 360 kilometers of the Pan American Highway, which runs from Pativica to Trujillo. And this is in the surf area in Peru. It's where the surf comes from. And it was a very interesting project because on the financing side was more than $350 million. And the IDB played an essential role in helping structure this loan. So it's a project which has been very positive for the country's connectivity, making it possible to connect ports and logistics hubs in Peru. Also, it makes it possible for small businesses to take their products to large cities. And this is being done with a long-term approach. These concessions expect to be there for the next 30, 40, or 50 years. So our relationship with the communities in which we operate is essential. We need to be seen as a good neighbor and not as someone who's simply coming in to do something which is going to be disruptive for the country. Thank you. Elena, how can we take some of the successful experiences from that cross-border experience to the region so that the roads you mentioned that cross from one country to another so that they can generate jobs, opportunities, and international connections? Well, there is no magic formula, Fabricio, but we do have experiences which are the result of all the work and all the collaboration done along the border between Spain and Portugal, and these could be applied. We would have to start by considering something which is important to me, and it's that when it comes to cooperation, it has to be cooperation between equals. The region is different, the countries are different, but when you cooperate, you need to do that on an equal footing, and you have to do it with something else. It has to be based on trust. Otherwise, collaboration is impossible. It doesn't work. So, having said that, what tools could be used? I think that we have lessons which could perhaps be replicable. For example, it's important to focus financial support and projects. We need to focus and limit the number of target sectors and strategies because we cannot do it all. There also are principles we need to uphold. For example, sound financial management. So that calls for standards because we are speaking of public funding. So there has to be control. And that is how it should be. Also, there's another principle which has been mentioned and is important in this context, and it's transparency. We need to avoid conflict of interest, and without that, it wouldn't be possible to do anything. And then there's the other principle, and that is partnership. Partnership, institutional collaboration at different levels and in different sectors, public and private, and different elements that are related to national, regional, local, urban authorities, civil society, social and economic players, and all must be engaged. So, in the program, which we mentioned before, between Spain and Portugal, included all of this. So, it's not about having a document or having something you can put on a shelf in a library. The reason we do this is to generate development that will benefit our country's citizens. So, one important part of this, and I'll stop after this, is how you organize your processes where you're calling for bids. You need to have rules and frameworks for the selection of projects or bids that are presented by different beneficiaries. And there has to be a selection process which leads to the selection of projects. Now, in between Spain and Portugal, we have more than 200 projects in the different areas I mentioned earlier. And we also, if we count previous programs, that would take us to more than 800 projects which are promoted and developed by this cooperation initiative. Thank you. We can continue discussing this after the panel. There are many elements. I know that we're getting close to the end, but Leonora, digital skills and connected to that infrastructure, digital infrastructure deficit, where do you see room for improvement for the region? I'll be very brief because we're close to the end, but a few years ago, we launched a report. It was done by Google. It was commissioned. Alfabeta did the project, and it brought or presented a series of public policy changes, we thought, measures which would help promote digital transformation in a number of countries, enabling them to become digital sprinters. That report was based on four pillars. One was discussed at length, and it was physical infrastructure development for digital infrastructure, physical capital. The second is the one you mentioned, Fabricio, and that's human capital, an infrastructure for the use and maintenance of that physical capital. And in that context, public private collaboration is very important, not only to improve digital skills, but also in addressing populations that have less access or have historically had less access to digital services. In the region, we still have a gender gap. It's significant. I know it was discussed this morning in the panels and will also be coming up tomorrow. Since 2017, we have trained more than 8 million individuals in digital skills. And as part of the announcement I mentioned before, the commitment to the region for the next 5 years, we will be developing and providing 1 million scholarships for career certificates so that we can help promote digital skills in youth and women. These are two of the target populations. And to that end, we also partner with the public sector and with others. Recently, we partnered with an NGO in the region called ProMujer to work with women in Mexico's Southwest, not only in digital skills, but also in helping them access microcredit. And we announced a partnership also with ProMujer last year to promote digital skills for women in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And we're working in Chile with CODEA, which is an organization which also works to promote digital skills. So in this pillar, there's been much partnership between the public and private sectors. We often works closely with the ministries of production and the economy and with the third sector to expand digital skills. The other two pillars I'd like to mention, if I may, and I will be brief, have to do with fostering the development of innovative technologies like artificial intelligence, for example, or the cloud first technologies that are important to generate technologies that boost productivity and competitiveness. And lastly, something Jose Juan said, which has to do with regulations. They are a key pillar, essential for digital technologies, and in that regard, we also need to have a public private conversation on the matter. Another thing we very much like in the region is DIPA. It's an agreement signed by Chile with two countries from outside the region, Singapore and New Zealand. And we know that other countries in the region are planning to follow suit. And it's to work with physical infrastructure, digital skills, and regional integration, integration with the world. I think this program is a model and which would help improve integration, not only in the region, but also with the rest of the world. Thank you. And with that, you are taking us to Giuseppina and what you've just said about inclusion and how technology and digitizing should be inclusion and development tools. That is our business as a development bank. Indeed, I know that I'm the last person to speak, so I'm between you and the reception. So I, I have to be brief, I know that. So I'd like to tell you about one experience that ties in with what has been said this afternoon, the importance of having a long-term vision and also public-private collaboration and transparency in managing these programs. We think that it's important for them to do this, especially at the regional level. There are a number of programs that are part of the 9 operations we have in these countries. We chose 3 as flagships because they involve key communities, the ones that are more exposed to flaws in inclusion. There's the one for women, which is called Conectadas, and it's aimed at connecting women. It was launched by GSMA in 2016 when it realized that only one gender had access to data in the region and that it was impossible to diversify that. And it's a good story for 2 reasons. One, by working with these communities of women who really had no access to the benefits or knowledge that comes with digitalization, they began working with in-person modules. These were classes which were offered with local partners in each of the countries. So each one does his or her job and tries to do it well. So we need to have that sensitivity. We need to have a direct contact with the local reality. So these partners have been working with us for a number of years. They selected the women, and when the women are asked, and we still ask them, what would you like to learn when it comes to digital tools, they tell us that they would like to be able to do business using social media, to have a WhatsApp group with their providers, knowing how to use a digital wallet so that they don't have to waste time and know how to better manage their finances. So this is a program which is running today. It's helped more than 700 women, and they want to learn more. So it's a community of people who now have an awareness. Another example, which is important. Why? Because we're speaking about inclusion and also about education and challenges. During the pandemic, education faced, I think, the biggest challenges. Educators, in addition to students, schools just disappeared. And this is something I tend to say school, the space, interaction, socialization. So, what we knew to be a school or what was thought of as education disappeared. And we have to say this, there were many ministries of education in the region which called upon us to become that partner. So that is how an operator becomes a dynamic force. So they asked us to help them to develop a curriculum. Why? To assist teachers, not just to deliver content on a screen or a monitor, but to develop the skills needed to communicate the warmth, the sensitivity, the connection with the student, the care. And so we began with Conectadas last year and then launched an online platform called Maestros Conectados or Connected Teachers. We've certified more than 450,000 teachers, and it doesn't end there. That's where value added comes in. They themselves want to share what they've learned, the knowledge they've acquired with other Spanish speaking countries, and they know how to do this. So that is inclusion because they will be vectors who will reach out to children who currently lack access to physical educational infrastructure. So it's a common vision, it's a shared responsibility, it's a sustainable approach. That's important. And it's also transparent. I think this is the kind of project that does produce results. So long term approach, institutions, and now that the IDB is 64 years old, we think it is in fact ideally positioned to be a partner to promote this agenda. There's also Connect Americas, a platform for entrepreneurs and for SMEs that follow us. It is a tool that makes it possible to expand the opportunities around the world. I love this conversation. I've learned a lot, and I'd like to thank you for coming on behalf of the IDB, and we will continue this conversation.